All right, great. Good afternoon. Well, it's really nice to have you guys here. I mean, last week was quite interesting. I mean, I had like, six people from 1,500 students. Yeah, it was quite interesting. Yeah. But I mean, I'm happy you guys are here today. And I don't know, for some odd reason, you all seem to be smiling at me. Are you Manchester United fans? No. I know I'm Manchester City, right? Yeah. So welcome to the repeat workshop, joint workshop, 233, 3020. So what I would like you guys to do is to complete the registers. So I've got two registers going around. One is for 2003 and the other one is for 3020, all right? So just complete the register. That's applicable to your grade. If you're doing second year, 2003, third year, 3020. I mean, this information is important because Sam Philby is running the evaluations. And of course, if she wishes, of course, if the system allows to give a student an award, you also want to make sure the student has been attending the workshops, because the workshops are important. I mean, generally with education, you expect if someone attends classes, well, one way or the other, everything else equal, they're expected to do well, right? Yeah. Anyway, so how many of you are attending, a workshop for the first time? Have you all been to my workshops have you all been to my workshops before? Who's attending for the first time? It's quite a number. Anyway, so look, my name is Samson Bewe, and I've been doing this for a few years, and those are my contact details. So essentially, I'm the workshop assistant for both second and third year. So if you've got any questions with regards to the essay, topic, you feel free to email me, and that's my email address. I'm normally found in the Writing Hub. Though, if you want to have a good chat with me, it's always best that you make an appointment, because, imagine 1,500 students approaching me, day in, day out, it becomes quite a challenge. So, of course, those are my details over there. And, these slides will be up on Vula later on today or perhaps tomorrow morning. And for those of you, that are here for the first time, this is a basic disclaimer, indicating that you should not at any one point reference these slides. Of course, the basic idea here is not for you to copy the information in the slides, but to be able to stimulate the way you approach the essay topic, right? So it's what I'm going to say. Rather, what will be mentioned in these slides is not the model answer, but of course, it's a way to begin to think about the essay. And what we try to do here is to get you guys thinking, right? To be able to have a good command of the essay topic. But how do you do that? It all goes back to how well you're founded in the subject area or the topic in question, all right? So do not reference my slides. And I mentioned this in the last lecture. A couple of people did reference my slides last year. It was in Bearway 2015. It was nice. I enjoyed it. It was pretty cool. Imagine in like 2 months and you've got close to like 300-400 citations. It was good. I was like a renowned author. It was quite good. But in academic writing, that is wrong. And I must warn that you might lose marks for that. So imagine just for referencing me and you end up losing a 5%. All right. That's really sad. Think about it. Yeah. You should trade carefully, right? So anyways, last week we had a very, very exciting time, right? We really had a very exciting time with the 5 people that were present. I don't think they're here today, but in any case, we had a very, very exciting time. And within the liberty of 45 minutes that we had, our goals were twofold, right? We essentially had a recap of what we may have done in workshop 1, and we went ahead to discuss a few things in workshop 2, of course, more or less of an extension. But what we did essentially is we redefined workshop 1, but we decided to add a bit of content to it. So I would advise, despite this being a recap of workshop 1, I would advise you to go to the the recap. Don't skip this section because I added 1 or 2 things. This will help you shape the discussion, all right? So first of all, we defined the learning outcomes. Remember, this is a joint workshop for 2003 as well as 3020. But at the end of the day, we do not expect the same level of understanding, all right? So for the second years, we expect more or less of a hybrid. I think I did mention this in workshop 1. So we expect you to apply economic theory and, cite economic theory and go ahead to apply economic theory. So it's a balance, all right? But with the third years, we expect you to more or less be able, be more skewed towards applying economic theory. And by this, I mean incorporate graphs, incorporate data analysis within your essay. Of course, this gives you a very coherent structure, a very good argument, right? So, I mean, there is a thin line between, striking a balance between theory and application. But of course, the markers are well trained to be able to identify that. But so from the second years, of course, if you choose to do some data analysis, that's a plus. But we expect you to more or less apply the economic theory that you've learned, to real-world problems. Of course, cite the economic theory, then apply it. For the third years, it's the other way around. Be more skewed towards economic theory. Applying the economic theory. Yeah. So another important issue that we spoke about, was the essay topic, all right? So we spoke about the essay topic, and essentially, for those of you who remember what the essay question is, or the questions, these are the two fundamental questions. So we're trying to look at the challenges of the education system in South Africa, right? We're trying to identify these challenges and how they impact on educational attainment, right? That's one fundamental question. The second question was, how can these be addressed in order to bring us, in line with our peers, all right? So these two questions are very important. If you choose to write an essay, right? Of course, you need to write an essay. You're going to write it under duress anyway. But if you're writing this essay, you need to address these two questions. It's important that you address these two questions. A failure to address these two questions is a decreasing function of your marks, because one way or the other, these questions count towards the marks. And of course, it's important to define what education attainment is, and it would be important to also understand not just what education attainment is and what is the education attainment of South Africa. That's a very, very important question. And of course, you could also look at what is the education attainment of other countries, all right? Because remember, that part of the question states that you should compare South Africa to its peers. So the biggest question is, how do you compare South Africa to its peers? Who are South Africa's peers? That's a very interesting question that we shall also look at in the recap. And of course, the second question is, tells you about how can these challenges be addressed. And of course, this should bring one thing to mind. We're talking about recommendations, all right? So remember, I did mention this last time. When you're recommending something, you can only recommend that which you've concluded, all right? So in your essay, do not go on a tangent making recommendations that are not even applicable to the challenges you may have identified in your essay. So bear that in mind. And one important thing I may have emphasized on the last time was, of course, you're accustomed to the norm that recommendations come before the conclusion. But this time around, we would want you to conclude first and then recommend, all right? So you're going to conclude, sum up your discussion, then make recommendation. We're not looking for revolutionary recommendations. By revolutionary, I mean that's going to change the entire education system. But bear in mind, we do not want to restrict your thinking. But, sometimes people tend to go on a tangent and write 10 pages of recommendations, etc., etc. But, well, we are looking for that essentially, but slightly limited. Be concise and to the point, all right? So identify a problem and make recommendation. For instance, if teacher absenteeism is the problem, all right? Is the problem, make recommendation based on that. How can you, make sure teachers are present in class? What measures will you put in place? That's the way to think about it. And by measures, I don't mean you write a whole page. Just, some brief lines. But of course, it should be significant. Just think about recommendations to carry perhaps maybe 20, 30%, 40% of the essay, all right? Does that make sense? So this brings us to the two fundamental questions. But of course, within the essay topic itself, we also identified two important questions, all right? Or not really questions per se, but the way the essay topic was presented. And of course, an important word there is pupils, right? So that should tell you something. In this particular case, we will be looking at, I'll call it school education. School education meaning primary as well as secondary, all right? And I will refer to tertiary education as post-secondary, all right? So in this particular case, you are advised to look at secondary education, all right? So whatever you do within your essay, focus on the secondary education aspect of things. And one basic place you want to start is just not to, of course, you want to go, perhaps you might take some time and look at the website or reports written by the Department of Education. But in this particular case, you want to focus on the Department of Basic Education. Of course, this draws a distinction between the Department of Basic Education as well as the Department of Higher Education in South Africa, right? There's HESER and there's Basic Education. So most of the policy documents you want to focus on are those prescribed by Basic Education Department, okay? And there is another interesting, wording in the essay topic, which is, of course, to deal with the budget, right? The basic argument is South Africa spends relatively more on basic education, or rather on education, as compared to its peers, and yet its standards, its education standards are quite poor. So in other words, you're being asked to draw a comparison, right? You're being asked to draw a comparison between South Africa and its peers. So one of the fundamental questions is, how do you begin to draw that comparison? And this is one thing I will highlight, right? I will highlight this in the subsequent discussion. So, of course, last time I did try to frame this discussion in such a way that, you need an introduction, you need a main body, and of course, you need a conclusion as well as recommendations, right? So, within the introduction, the basic idea is for you to define where the problem came from, or rather, of course, not entirely, but for the better part. Apartheid has a significant role to play with the current education system. So you want to be able to identify in your discussion what happened before apartheid. Of course, just to give you some flavor, what happened was you had quite a number of disadvantaged schools that were poorly funded, and very few schools that were properly funded. All right. So in other words, if the huge chunk of population goes to poor schools, you would expect that. Most of the good chunk of the population would receive a very poor education, right? So that's how you want to begin to think about this. And of course, you want to also understand what was the rate of access. So this I will explain in the subsequent slide, where we talk about the rate of access to education. So post-apartheid, right? What did government try to do in order to get rid of the inequalities inherited, during the apartheid regime? So they tried to increase government spending on education. So the basic idea, when you look at the economics of education, everything else equal, if you increase spending on education, you would expect that access to education is going to increase. By access, we mean the number of people going to school. And we would expect that educational quality will improve, because you've got more resources, etc. Because resources are there to, they normally tend to improve the quality of education. That's what they try to do. But of course, you also want to understand how this intervention affected access to education. All right, you also want to understand how it affected the quality of education. So this discussion, right, I'm giving you a good number of the key points, but it would be important for you to do the literature, to be able to quantify some of these things. This shows the research, all right? So at this level, we're not expecting you to do something revolutionary, but that would be good. It does not limit your thinking, just in case, all right? It would be nice if you do a very unique piece, but just follow the guidelines, because you're building, your research skills, etc., etc. So as you write this paper, this essay, be able to quantify some of these things. Maybe talk about how much government spent, right? For instance, I'll give you an example. One of the issues, why the South African spending on education is highly contended is because it's quite a lot. In 2010, the entire fiscal budget, rather fiscal budget, education took up 20% of that. And that's quite a lot, right? So those are some of the issues, you see. I just gave you something right there, 20% in 2010. That's the way we want you to think, to be able to identify figures in the literature. Because in economics, remember, there's no right or wrong answer. There's a well-argued answer, right? As long as you can provide a very solid, concrete argument backed with data, that's pretty good, right? So of course, one of the biggest questions is how do you begin to compare South Africa to its peers, all right? So one of the fundamental questions here is how do you even begin to think about this? Because you're thinking about developing countries. One would say, what about China? One would say, what about India? Right? These are developing countries, right? These are developing countries, of course. But the safest you'd want to choose is, because the essay question states that South Africa is not doing much better than its peers, who happen to be low-income countries. So, in other words, you want to pick a country that perhaps it's got much lower income. By income, I mean GDP, right? You want to pick a country that's got, a lower GDP than South Africa, because, I mean, that's a low-income country. And, of course, there's a way you can begin to think about this, right? And if you're looking at regional, if you're looking at, an area you would want to focus on, you may choose Africa at large, Sub-Saharan Africa. You might focus on SADC as well, right? But a critical issue, I'm sure, something that you guys are battling with is, but how do you even begin to think about this country? So one very good example is by looking at the data, right? So I will provide some databases later on that actually quantify, the quality of education in Africa, or education attainment. I mean, when you look at that data, of course, it should be able to give you an indication of which country would be more appropriate, all right? Does that make sense? Okay. So this is basically, this slide basically tells us, I mean, if you're trying to compare South Africa to its peers, what indicators will you look at to? Of course, one of the basic things you want to look at is being able to look at how much South Africa spends on education, as well as what South Africa's peers spends on education. But remember, I made a distinction earlier on when I was talking about the Department of Education. I made one distinction, and which is you've got the Department of Basic Education and you've got the Department of Higher Education. So if you'd like to understand how much South Africa spends on education, you want to be able to look at the budget and disaggregate it, all right? You want to disaggregate the budget and focus on what is the contribution of school education. Rather, what is the ratio of school education to GDP, all right? School education, because when you look at the entire education budget, it actually, takes into account of tertiary education as well, right? So you want to leave out the tertiary education part. Do you guys understand? Am I making sense? Great, so that's what you want to do. But I mean, like I mentioned earlier on, we're here to stimulate the way you think. So the indicators which you choose to use to make a cross-country comparison is entirely at your discretion. But of course, an important indicator you might want to look at is, might want to look at the GDP, I mean the education spending to GDP ratio. And you might want to also look at, education attainment. You can compare that, right? There are a whole lot of indicators you can use, and most of these you find them in the documents that I'll prescribe to you guys. Not really prescribe, but just make you aware of. It's entirely at your discretion whether to use them or not. Yeah. So we did talk about, I mean, people asked me questions last time. What should be in the introduction? Of course, we expect, a sweet, juicy introduction, giving us some flavor of where this, this problem is coming from. But of course, you cannot fit everything in the introduction. I mean, at most, I would expect an introduction close to half a page, all right? Close to half a page with a thesis statement included. I mean, if you write me a whole page, well, that's fine, but I will be lost and you're running out of your word count, right? So you can give a very brief, juicy introduction with a thesis statement right in there, and after which you can proceed with your discussion, building up the story, etc., right? But anyway, so though this is, like I mentioned, there's a disclaimer to this. Most of the things I put down here are entirely my own thinking, right? So I talked about socioeconomic factors. You can begin to look at this problem in terms of socioeconomic factors. And of course, you might want to try and understand what are the challenges from the perspective of schools, right? And of course, I mean, very basic things you might want to look at is infrastructure. Perhaps that could be a problem, all right? And you might also look at the pupils themselves, right? One big issue is, spending on education does not necessarily mean a child is going to do well in school, all right? There are a whole lot of factors that are actually involved. And for you guys that have done, have looked at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you understand that you've got physiological needs, all right? Sometimes it's hard to study on an empty stomach. It's very, very difficult. So you find that, schools might be well funded, but because the child is not well cared for at home, that becomes a problem. Or because the child does not eat at home, does not have a place to sleep, does not get enough rest, does a whole lot of work at home, that can impact on a child's performance at school. So these are some of the issues you might want to look at. And of course, it would be important for you, I mean, I would really find it, interesting if you were to highlight the fact that spending on education does not mean that education attainment and quality is going to improve. It would be important for you to highlight that point. Yeah. And the last part is, of course, the economy. It's important to understand what are the dynamics in the economy, you know, the level of wealth and income inequality, because these already give you an indication of why people may not be doing, children might not be doing well in school. But what's also important is, look, I've put down these points, right? So as you write your essay, you know, it would really be sad if you gave me back all these points. You know, you talk about schools, you know, schools and how infrastructure is bad. It would be nice if you were to support this with empirical evidence. So in other words, to do well in this essay, you need to read, right? You need to be able to support this, you know, with the literature. Of course, if infrastructure is a problem, you need to support that. Which study says infrastructure is a problem? Because, look, in schools, we may have a lot of problems, but the biggest issues, we're looking for problems that are actually significant, all right? So you cannot relate to a shortage of books in a school nearby and aggregate that for the whole country. What if the whole country is not experiencing a shortage of books? You need to be able to think about that. So it's not an essay where you go and you just write, oh yeah, pupils, you know, lack parental care, etc., etc. Has it been quantified? Has the research been done? All right. So another issue I spoke about was the issue of teachers, right? The issue of teachers is very, very important. And of course, you want to be able to understand, does South Africa have the right quality of teachers? And does South Africa have enough teachers? Or does South Africa have enough teachers in the rural areas? I mean, bear in mind, one of the biggest issues is most poor schools are actually in the rural areas, right? They're actually in the rural areas. But if you don't have enough teachers in the rural areas, that becomes a problem. Better yet, if you know you've got more poor schools than rich schools, that's a big problem because the good chunk of the population is actually going there. So you want to be able to actually look at this and you know, have a little brief discussion. I talked about this, you know, about this section in the first workshop in much detail. So just look at that and you will understand. And of course, I did speak about government as well. You know, how government tends to fund, you know, schools. And you can also find this in the first workshop. And of course, this is a pretty slightly unique case, so I did speak about it, which is essentially about the curriculum, right? You want to be able to understand, because, look, it's more or less like how we say everything is not perfect in life. So there are times when you've got a policy on paper, it looks very, very good, right? It looks very, very good. But when you implement the policy, you find that, of course, there are policy lags, right? And you find that the general outcome, I mean, the delivered policy is not all, it's not really what was actually designed on paper. And these are policy lags. And it's argued that in South Africa, actually, the intended curriculum and the delivered curriculum are actually quite, there's a huge, a huge difference, or a huge diversion between the two. And that's one thing you might want to look at. So anyway, so today now, let's jump on today's, I mean, having had a bit of flavor of what we did in workshop one. So today we essentially going to look at how to conduct policy analysis, which is of course important because at the end of the day, what you're trying to understand is government has increased spending on education. But remember, government spending is always guided by policy, all right? But then the biggest challenge is this is not transformed into a good education system. So we're going to try and understand, in case you come across policy documents, how you can begin to analyze policy. Then we'll try and look at how to analyze data. I would really, really find it very, very exciting. I mean, so would the other markers, to see you guys presenting data and analyzing the data. Presenting data is a very easy task, and I will just show you some of the ways that you can present data, and of course some potential sources of data, as well as what kind of graphs you can draw. And of course, you need to make conclusions and recommendations. But so what's important here now is you need to be able, if you interrogate, you interrogate the literature, you need to be able to understand, for instance, what are the reasons for the policy. And in this particular case, you want to understand what was the reason for an increase in government spending, right? Why did government spend unusually? I mean, of course, you didn't say unusually because we're not comparing to anything, but I mean, such a high figure as compared to other countries, right? And you also want to understand what was the reason, what did government aim to achieve by spending so much money on education? And of course, you want to understand, has government achieved this? you also want to understand what do other people say about the spending pattern of government, all right? And you also want to understand, of course, what are the likely effects, and of course, and what do other people say are the likely effects. And of course, an important aspect in this case is you also want to understand how this policy is applied. And of course, you also want to understand the social trends. And in this particular case, policy has been implemented in order to address the inequalities, that were inherited, from the apartheid regime. And that's, of course, a social trend. It was more or less of racial injustice, all right? You want to highlight those kind of factors. And you also want to understand how this policy, shapes around government policy, and essentially, the ideology behind, the ideology behind this developmental agenda. Yeah, and in any case, you also want to understand how, of course, policy relates, to the entire country, right? Is there any difference between funding schools in in rural areas as well as schools in urban areas? And you also want to understand how this relates to essentially, the global community. Do these standards of education compare well to other countries? And this, of course, is what we talked about earlier on, of how to, to be able to relate your essay to South Africa's peers. All right. And of course, this is basically, the expected impact of a policy. In this case, if you spend on education, what you would be expecting is, of course, an increase in quality and an increase in access to education. But of course, has this happened? What have been the losses, all right? You want to identify what have been the losses. And in these particular cases, the losses have been huge spending. And of course, I'm not sure whether to call it a wastage of money or not, but yeah. There's some of the things you also want to look at. And you also want to understand who has been resisting this policy. And trying to understand who's been resisting this policy, a very good example is you might want to also look at what has been the relationship between private schools and public schools, right? What is the relationship? Yeah, what do private schools say about public schools, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And you also, of course, want to understand what have been their unintended consequences. Of course, sometimes, you cannot control for everything. You enact policy, it might have, consequences. And of course, some of these might be negative consequences, but did government plan for these? Yes or no? Those are some of the questions you want to be able to highlight. So an important aspect in this essay, well, to be able to do well in this essay. So remember, the basic exercise is just to get you guys thinking, all right? And of course, the big issue here is how to present data. And of course, I think you guys are very, very familiar with these methods of presenting data: line graphs, bar graphs, pie charts, histograms, tables. Who's not familiar with these? I'm sure you're all familiar with these ones, right? But the issue is people, quite often, we tend to think it's very difficult to present data using these. And we hardly see them in essays, all right? And in fact, it's pretty easy to draw these diagrams there. It's very, very easy to present data using these tables, these charts, etc., etc. But the basic idea is for you to be able to present a chart, you need to be able to think about the economics behind what you're doing. A very simple example is if you're trying to look at the level of spending of South Africa in another country, you try and look at, for instance, the education to GDP ratio, right? Just take it back 5 years, right? Account for a 5-year period or a 6-year period. Plot that against that of South Africa's peer. See, that looks pretty. Graph looks pretty, and you can actually explain that graph, and that's economic analysis. As simple as that. Someone's able to see the trend. It's pretty simple. One could choose to show a pie chart. A pie chart. This can be used to show, in a particular year, the proportion of spending on education relative to the entire budget. Some of these graphs don't need to be drawn. They're actually drawn. You just need to get them from papers and policy documents, all right? So remember, within your essay, what limits you is your word count, not the number of pages. So you can have a good number of graphs as long as they're well explained. And to explain a graph sometimes, most of the people that will be marking your graphs are patrons of the art when it comes to economics. So you don't really have to go in a lot of detail, but as long as you capture the foundation of your argument, well, in relation to you presenting that graph, that's all that's needed, all right? So you guys can choose to look at these graphs and draw as many as you can. Yes?
Do you have to draw all graphs from scratch again like last year, or can we copy graphs from other places?
Well, look, it depends. I mean, if you've got a chance to draw, to draw a graph, then that's fine. I mean, at the end of the day, remember, sometimes you can be limited to the number of graphs to draw. For instance, I just talked about a graph right now, a simple line graph or a simple histogram where you plot the GDP of, the ratio of education spending to GDP of South Africa and its peer. I don't think you're going to find that anywhere. So you have to draw that graph because it's essentially economic way of thinking because you're trying to analyze something. And unless someone has analyzed that already, well, that's good. You can use such a graph. Yeah, but if you don't have the chance to draw the graph, it would be easy for you to just to copy the graph. You can just make the graph on your own. Yeah. And sometimes, when you draw a graph alone, it actually looks much more pretty. Yeah. Sometimes we can see, because we also look at your soft copies and we can see all these graphs, copy and paste, kind of thing. But either way, sometimes, look, with academic writing, actually, it's important to have a good and well-written piece. Sometimes, a marker will be just mesmerized by the way you write, how pretty your paper looks. And I'll be like, God damn, this is an A student. Not that we do mark like that, but anyway. But sometimes, yeah. Sometimes we tend to judge books by their cover. You just look at it like, oh yeah, this is the real deal. Yeah, you had a hand up, yeah.
When we do make our own graph, right, we get it from various sources, right?
Yes.
Now we obviously have to reference that. Do we have to show our workings and everything at the end, or?
No, don't show your workings. Don't show your workings. Just, what's important is if you get data from the Department of Education in South Africa and you get data from the Department of Education Zimbabwe, right? Just under, if it's a table, if you draw a table, just right under there where it says source, right, Department of Education, South Africa, 2016. It depends if it's from a database. If it's from a policy document, you want to put the year the policy document was released, all right? And do the same for Zimbabwe in the same line. You do the same, you just put a semicolon, and Zimbabwe, Department of Education Zimbabwe, which means you're just acknowledging where you got the data from. Because remember, with academic writing, you're trying to argue a case here, all right? You're trying to argue a case. So if one looks at your data and they're like, no, these figures don't look right, you can easily back yourself and say, well, I got them from the Department of Education in South Africa. It's not my problem, it's the data. And Department of Education is quite a reliable department within the country. Yeah, right? Yeah. Good stuff, right? Yeah. Yeah, this is cool stuff. But anyway, so look, so what I decided to do here is, of course, a very big question is, where do you get data from, all right? Where do you get data from? So I tried to do a bit of the dirty work for you guys, and, it took me a bit of time. While you were chilling, I was up there, checking these out, having a look and see, well, so of course, like I mentioned, go look at the Department of Education, Basic Education website. They've got a couple of fancy reports. Actually, I just didn't want to mention it, but they've got this good data set that goes back to it's so damn pretty. There's so much you can do when you look at it. It's really, really cool. And when you go to the Stats SA website as well, they've got a couple of reports. They also have a database, which is so cool, so easy to use. Just like click, 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 click. Then you've got the SACMEC, right? SACMEC is a Southern African consortium for monitoring educational quality. Now, that is the real deal. You want to look at that because they've got very, very good data there. And in fact, it's even one of the databases you might want to use to actually identify the country which the peer, South Africa's peer. You might want to use the SACMEC database. It's pretty cool, pretty easy to work with. And it also tells you a whole lot of stuff, especially about teachers. It's quantified, all right? Though, to have a well-rounded discussion, I would not expect you to only use reports from SACMEC. Use as many sources as possible. That gives you a more in-depth discussion, and it also differentiates, your paper from the other person, all right? Which, of course, should be an increasing function of your marks. But anyway, so what I try to do here is I try to give you a very simple example of how to begin to analyze data, all right? This, of course, is just hypothetical data. I know, I'm pretty scared someone's going to copy this and put it in the essay. Oh, my God, this would be a big mistake. It's hypothetical data, all right? This is hypothetical data, you know, data you make up after a glass or two of wine, etc., etc. But look, so, yeah, I mean, of course, you need to be able to understand. I mean, so we just don't present data, right? We just don't present data. There has to be a reason. There has to be a rationale for presenting the data, right? I mean, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to show a trend in the data? Of course, sometimes you want to show a pattern. You might want to say, well, education spending in South Africa, spending on education has been increasing. So you might want to show, maybe your aim would be to show an upward trend in the graph. Let's say you've got a graph, you want to show an upward trend. Maybe that is your objective. And of course, sometimes you might want to disprove a theory, right? To disprove a theory is maybe the theory, you know, the theory of, you know, if education states that when you increase spending on education, you expect education equality to go down. So you might have a graph plotting education equality as well as, I mean, spending on education as well as quality in education. And in South Africa, you might find that maybe spending on education is going up, but the quality of education remains fairly constant, or perhaps it's going down. Going down, well, no, it's highly debatable. But anyway, that's your job, guys. Anyway, so you need to be able to also understand that as, I mean, is what I'm doing making economic sense? So remember, you know, to write a very good paper sometimes just needs you to have a good basic understanding of economics. So remember, you don't have to do something revolutionary, but it has to make sense with the basics, of course. Add a bit of flavor, you know, by looking at, you know, more, you know, slightly detailed analysis. And another question you want to, because I mean, at the end of the day, you have a statement. For instance, you say, teacher absenteeism has been on the increase in South Africa, right? That's just a statement. I mean, it's not backed by anything. But you might want to support that with data and say, according to, not Mbewe 2016, but according to somebody, teacher absenteeism has increased by blah, blah, blah. You see? So at the end of the day, you are supporting your initial statement with data. Similarly, you might argue that teacher absenteeism has been on the rise, and in fact, you know, you can actually use a graph, because sometimes it's easy to see a graph. Because remember, when a marker is reading your paper, remember we've got this whole process of fact that, I mean, you know what you want to say, all right? So you're encoding your thoughts, you're putting them on paper, and you expect someone else to decode your thoughts. That's the most critical issue. So you want a marker to have a very easy job when reading a paper, all right? So you want to present things that are easy to understand. And the graph, in most instances, is very, very easy to understand as long as it's drawn properly and to scale, okay? And now, so I came up with this basic example. Like I mentioned, I put a disclaimer to this one. And what I did here is I spoke about the fact that there is a shortage of teachers in the education system, all right? And in this particular case, in country X, okay? And of course, we're trying to make a comparison between country X and country Y, okay? And a big issue here is, how do you begin to think about this? So imagine you're reading the literature and you find that teacher absenteeism is quite a teacher shortages, is a very big issue. But how do you begin to think about this if you want to present data? That's a very interesting question, right? But how would you proxy this? How would you think this is a problem, right? That's the way to begin to think about it. And in this case, I thought using the teacher to learner ratio, because you would expect, you know, if this was primary school and all of you had me as a teacher, me alone, that's quite, you know, it's quite a big class. But if we had 2-3 more teachers, we would expect that, you know, with more teachers, students are given more attention, or pupils are given more attention, and therefore this improves the process of learning. So in this case, what I chose to do was to try and understand how the shortage of teachers in country X, right, is a challenge, and how we can begin to measure this, and of course, how we can begin to measure this and what impact this has. So I tried to identify the teacher-to-learner ratio, and what I did was I came up with some hypothetical values. So assuming country X is the one with the problem and country Y is South Africa's peer, all right? So in 2010, this tells you that in country X, remember, this is just an example. So we're assuming there's one school in country X and one school in country Y. So in 2010, we had 80 pupils to one teacher. Like I mentioned earlier on, the fewer the teachers and the more the students, the level of learning is decreased, right? So in country X, look at this, and it's actually increasing. So you had 80 teachers, one teacher to 80 pupils, 95 to 1, 102 to 1, 109 to 1, and the number was like increasing. And in country Y, we had 45 teachers, right? 45 pupils to one teacher. But when you compare 2010 in country X and 2010 in country Y, you find that, the number of students in country Y are actually, half less than the number of students in country X, okay? So at the end of the day, we can begin to think about how can we present this case. And one issue here is, it's entirely at your discretion what graph you choose to use, but I chose to use a histogram in any case. So look, we've presented the data here, and look at the data. It's pretty, right? Looks pretty, right? Come on, guys. yeah. Anyways, yeah, it does look pretty. Anyway, I don't need you guys to tell me. Yeah. Anyway, so we've got a histogram here, which is pretty cool. But what can we say about the histogram? Anyone? What can we say about the histogram? Yeah, don't feel shy. There's no right or wrong answer. There is normally a correct answer to a wrong question. Yeah, you guys didn't get the joke, right? Correct answer to a wrong question. Oh. Just think about it. You're gonna laugh eventually. I know. Anyway, so what can you guys tell me about this histogram? Oh, someone says it's easy to interpret. Yeah. But at the end of the day, look, you can say something. At the end of the day, you're trying to show how teacher shortages have affected the education system, right? And the big issue here is you want to argue the case of we've got fewer teachers. But the teacher-to-learner ratio is quite poor in country X as compared to country Y. But then, this is not a complete discussion here. You need to back it up with something. Maybe you might want to relate these figures to the educational attainment. So a very good example, I'll take you back to the case of South Africa, all right? So for instance, you do such kind of analysis. You look at the teacher-learner ratio, learner-teacher ratio, can be interchangeable. Yeah. So you want to understand, well, what has the shortage of teachers done? That's one question you want to ask. And how can we detect the shortage of teachers and how it impacts on the education system? It's through a decreased, teacher learning ratio. And you argue the case that, well, if you've got very few teachers, you expect that students or pupils won't get the right level of education or the right attention or the sufficient amount of attention. Then you can go ahead and support that by looking at the educational attainment. You can say, well, it could be part of the reason why the educational attainment is poor, right? Do you guys get how you can begin to think about this? So this is just an example, but it's a very small things like that, It's just the way you think about economics that actually shapes your discussion, and it actually, builds the way you think. Yeah. Yeah. Seems I left you guys puzzled. Yeah. But you guys gotta admit, man, like the histogram was pretty. Anyway. So of course, the conclusions, well, these are self-explanatory. You guys have been writing essays now. For those in second year, this is like your third essay. And, this is not rocket science. And, in a conclusion, one basic thing that we do not want to see is you guys adding new information. So make sure the new information, is not in the conclusion. If you want to sum up any information, it needs to be in the main body, right? The main body or part of the introduction. And recommendations, remember I mentioned it should not be revolutionary. It should not be revolutionary, but it can be. It would be nice, but by revolutionary, don't write 10 pages of recommendations. That's not advisable. Yeah. So essentially, this sums up my discussion, and I know this essay is due right when you get back. For some of you, I'll get to bump into you in the tutorial workshops. I'll be running a couple of those. But now, I want to just take a couple of questions from you guys. If you guys have got questions, feel free to ask me. Yeah. Yeah.
How many problems would you recommend that we point out in our essay?
Yeah. So the question here is, how many problems would I recommend you point out in the essay? Well, as many as you can, but bear in mind we're looking for significant problems, all right? Like early on I gave an example of you noticing a school that's having troubles with books. Is that the case nationally? How does that relate to educational attainment? So you want to choose problems that are actually significant. For instance, you'd want to understand what are the dynamics with teachers. Do you have enough teachers in the rural areas? In your recommendations, in the first workshop, I talked about the fact that is teaching a paid profession? Is it paid skilled labor or a profession in South Africa? These are like some of the recommendations you want to be able to think about, all right? So any number of challenges can be identified within the essay, but make sure they're relevant and significant. And of course, it would be really ridiculous for you to give us like 2 challenges, right? Yeah, there must be a good number. Yeah. Yes.
At the earlier stage, was only focused on 2 challenges because we're not going to have enough words to go through more.
Was that, well, look, I would strongly, well, that's a good point from him, but at the end of the day, look, it depends on how you look at the problem, all right? It depends on how you look at the problem. Sometimes you find that problems are interconnected, and you might find that maybe the big issue is not, for instance, your heading could be teachers, right? Teachers, but within teachers, you find that you've got a problem with teacher shortages, right? Teacher absenteeism. All those are problems that branch of teachers. But I would advise that you put as many significant problems as possible. Yeah. Yeah. Because when you focus on 2, well, it depends on what greater detail you want to, argue a case. Yeah. But remember, a good number of these problems are interconnected. For instance, if you talk about teachers, like I mentioned earlier on, you might touch on a number of things. If you talk about pupils, you might touch on the fact that they're not properly fed at home, etc., etc. All those are challenges, but sub-challenges identified in your main theme of your argument. Yeah. Any more questions? Questions? Comments? Concerns? Yeah. But it's a pretty straightforward essay, right? It's pretty straightforward. Okay. Sorry, guys. Just it's very important to listen to these questions. They're very, very important because you get to learn a thing or 2. Yeah.
Well, assuming that we should and can use our textbook, what theory should we base this on? Because this seems quite different from the stuff that we've been doing in class.
Yeah. Look. So this is a very interesting question. I'm sure for those of you that were in the first workshop, yeah. So his question is, look, what theory can he use in his textbook? Because this seems quite different from, your occasional second-year economics. Of course, I agree. It's a bit different. But remember, you guys are writing this essay under duress. This is the budget speech competition. So it's not set by UCT. It's set by, the Nedbank budget speech competition. But yet again, you need to be able to understand. Go and look at some basic literature in education, right? Some basic stuff on education, right? At the end of the day, look, this is economics, and you're looking at it from a macroeconomic perspective. But remember, you only have macroeconomics because it's built on microeconomic fundamentals. So one way or the other, your microeconomics tends to filter into the macroeconomics. Yeah.
To continue from that, should we use first year theory as well? And could we reference the first year textbook?
Yeah, well, look, that's a very, so his question is, can he use theories from first year, to answer his, to respond to his essay question. And at the end of the day, you use theory because it's applicable. So as long as the theory is applicable and you can justify it, you can argue it, well, that is fine. You can use theory from first year, as long as it makes economic sense. Okay? Yeah.
Just in terms of integrating economic theory into the essay, so when you identify problems, let's say that the student-teacher ratio is too high, and you should argue that in general it's better to have a low number. That's more common sense in economic theory. How do you integrate?
Sorry, just come again? Yes.
The idea that you shouldn't have too many students to one teacher unless they're economic. That's how do you integrate economic theory into that particular problem?
Well, see, okay, so his question is, it's not economic theory to actually state that, well, students need to have, is it fewer teachers to do well? Is that what you say? More teachers to do well? So actually that's part of economics, all right? So economics is not generally looking at theories. It's, for instance, from basic, first year, it's allocating limited resources to provide for unlimited ones. So at the end of the day, you've got an abstract way of thinking, right? If I'm teaching these two ladies here, right? And you've got two teachers teaching him and him. Who do you think might get a better education? Of course, a whole lot of factors play a huge role here. But from general thinking, we would expect these guys to get a much better education. And that's economics. That's economics of education. Right. So that is economic theory, on its own. That's the rationale behind it. Yeah. Does it make sense? Is anyone convinced, confused? Yeah. Are you convinced? Does that make sense to you? Okay. So economic theory does not, mean you draw a graph. No, it's a way of thinking, right? What would you call, what conforms to a priori expectation? A very simple statement I gave earlier on was, well, the economics of education, argue that if you increase spending, you expect that education quality and access will increase. But of course, a whole lot of factors that actually affect education, the education attainment, all right, and how education improves. That's economic theory. So it's basically an a priori expectation. That's what economic theory is about. Yeah. I would give a very basic example. Economic theory would state that, for anyone who attended the workshop, everything else equal, you're expected to do much better than the person who did not attend the workshop. That's economic theory. But remember, you can put in a whole lot of factors here. It could be that the person who did not attend the workshop might be super smart. It could be an issue. Or it could be maybe the person who did not attend the workshop just does not understand the lectures. There's a whole lot of factors. But at the end of the day, there is an a priori expectation, all right? So when you look at the teacher-learner ratio, we would expect that a teacher with very few students, right? Very few students is able to give them more attention and therefore gives them a better learning environment, as opposed to a teacher with a lot of students who cannot give the same amount of attention to the students. That's the way of thinking. That's the economic theory. But does empirical evidence say that? Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, more questions? No, in that case, look, I'll be in the front, and if anything, just pop through and ask questions. Yeah.